The letter trembled in Adelaide Foster's hands. The Arizona sun beat down on the platform, hot and angry, like it knew she was an outsider. She'd traveled 2,000 miles from Boston, a lifetime away, for a new beginning, for a husband, for a home. But the telegram she held had burned that dream to ash. Not what was expected. Just 4 words, scrawled in a hurry. 4 words to tell her that the man who'd promised her marriage had taken one look at her 32-year-old face and decided she was too old, too used up, a bad investment. She folded the paper, the crisp edges biting into her palm. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of all these strangers in this dusty, forgotten town called Sweetwater Junction. Her entire life was packed into a single trunk and 2 small bags sitting beside her on the splintered wood. Everything she owned. "Madam," a voice drawled. The station master. His face was a road map of wrinkles. His eyes held a flicker of pity she didn't want. "Train back east won't be through for another 3 days." He pointed a thumb down the dusty street. "There's a boarding house. Takes in respectable ladies." Adelaide just nodded. She couldn't trust her voice. Her last few dollars had been spent on this one-way ticket to a future that had just slammed the door in her face. The school in Boston had closed its doors to her, and with no family left, a mail-order bride ad had seemed like a lifeline. Now, it was a noose. As the station master helped with her bags, a noise cut through the haze, laughter, sharp and bright. 3 young boys darting through the crowd like wild colts. And behind them, a tall man strode, his face lost in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. "Samuel! Elijah! Matthew!" His voice boomed, a mix of frustration and something else. Affection. "Get back here before you knock someone clean over." It was too late. The youngest, a little tornado of a boy no older than 5, slammed directly into Adelaide's skirts. She stumbled backward, the world tilting on its axis. But before she could fall, strong hands gripped her shoulders, steadying her. She looked up, straight into the eyes of the man who'd been chasing them. They were the color of a summer storm, gray and intense. His face was tanned by the sun, creased at the corners of his eyes, his jawline rough with stubble. He wasn't handsome in the way Boston men were. He was something else entirely, something real. "My apologies, madam," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "My boys seem to forget their manners when they see a train." Adelaide found a smile from somewhere. No harm done. His gaze lingered on her, taking in the trunk, the bags, the lost look in her eyes. "Just arriving, or just leaving?" Something about his directness made her tell the truth. "Neither, it seems. I was supposed to be married." She held up the crumpled telegram. "But the arrangement has fallen through." His brow furrowed. He extended a calloused hand. "Thomas Jensen. I own a cattle ranch, about 10 miles out of town." "Adelaide Foster," she replied, her hand feeling small and soft in his. The middle boy, all knees and elbows, tugged on his father's sleeve. "Pa, can we get candy?" Thomas ruffled his hair. "If you and your brothers apologize properly to the lady." 3 pairs of eyes, all wide and suddenly shy, turned to her. The oldest, maybe 10, stepped forward. "We're sorry, madam." Adelaide's bruised heart softened just a little. Apology accepted. Thomas Jensen was studying her again, a thoughtful, calculating look in his stormy eyes. "Miss Foster, forgive me for being forward, but you seem to be in a tight spot." He hesitated, then pushed on, his words coming out in a rush. "I've been advertising for a mail-order bride myself." Adelaide blinked. The world tilted again. Not that I'm proposing," he said quickly, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "But I do have a proposition. The boys' tutor just left for California. They're falling behind on their letters. He took a breath. Come stay at my ranch as a paid guest. You could teach them while you decide what to do next. It's better than a boarding house. She stared at him, a total stranger, offering her a job, a place to stay, just minutes after meeting her. It made no sense. People weren't this kind, not without a reason. The boy's mother, she asked, her voice cautious. A shadow passed over his face, as quick and dark as a hawk's wing. Died. Fever. 4 years ago. He looked from his son's hopeful faces to her own weary one. It's just been us. There was no trickery in his eyes, just a deep-seated tiredness that she recognized. It was the same exhaustion she saw in her own reflection. He was desperate, and so was she. I was a school teacher in Boston, she heard herself say. I could help with their education. Relief washed over his face, so potent it was almost visible. Then it settled. He turned to his sons. Boys, after you get your candy, we're taking Miss Foster home with us. As Adelaide followed this stranger and his 3 wild sons toward the general store, a single thought echoed in her mind. She had come to Arizona to be a rancher's wife, and in the space of an hour, she'd been rejected, stranded, and then hired to be a teacher on a ranch. It was a strange twist of fate. But as she looked at the back of Thomas Jensen's head, at the confident set of his shoulders, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. His offer was too convenient, too perfect. She was walking into something. She just didn't know what it was yet. The wagon ride to Jensen's Crossing was a 2-hour journey over rutted trails that shook Adelaide to her bones. The boys, perched in the back with her luggage, peppered her with questions about Boston, their young voices a constant stream of curiosity. Thomas drove the team with a quiet competence, his large hands sure on the reins. They don't see many new faces out here, he said, glancing at her. Especially not educated ladies from the East. I don't mind, she assured him, and she found it was true. The boys' simple questions were a welcome distraction from the chaos of her thoughts. Then, as they crested a low hill, he pointed. There it is, Jensen's Crossing. Adelaide caught her breath. It wasn't a dusty cabin. It was a sprawling, handsome house of rough-hewn timber, nestled against a backdrop of distant purple mountains. Outbuildings and a large corral dotted the landscape. Beyond, cattle grazed on grasslands that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a kingdom, a small, self-contained world. It's beautiful, she said, and she meant it. A flicker of pride softened his rugged features. Built most of it myself. As they pulled up to the house, an older woman came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was stout, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun. Her eyes were small and sharp. That's Mrs. Wilkins, Thomas explained in a low voice. She comes out from town a few days a week to cook and clean. Been a godsend. Adelaide felt a fresh wave of nerves. What would this woman think of her? Mrs. Wilkins's eyes narrowed as Thomas helped Adelaide down from the wagon. Her gaze was an appraisal, cold and thorough. Didn't know we were expecting company, Mr. Jensen. This is Miss Foster, Thomas said, his voice even. She'll be staying with us for a bit, helping the boys with their schooling. Mrs. Wilkins gave a short, sharp nod. Her eyes swept over Adelaide one more time before she turned back toward the house. Well, it's about time someone put a leash on those wild ones. Supper's at 6. I made stew. The acceptance was grudging, at best. Adelaide felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. This woman did not want her here. Thomas showed her to a small guest room at the back of the house. It was clean and simple, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over a vegetable garden. Compared to the fleabag boarding house she'd been facing, it was a palace. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said from the doorway. After he left, she sank onto the bed, the silence of the house pressing in on her. From rejected bride to temporary teacher. It was a reprieve, a place to catch her breath. But the coldness in Mrs. Wilkins's eyes had planted a seed of doubt. Later, at the supper table, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The boys were on their best behavior, but Mrs. Wilkins watched Adelaide's every move. Miss Foster was a school teacher in Boston, Thomas explained to the housekeeper, as if trying to justify Adelaide's presence. Mrs. Wilkins sniffed. About time. Samuel can barely do his sums, and Elijah's reading has gone backward since the last one left. She stabbed a piece of potato with her fork. Mr. Phillips. He didn't last long either. The implication was clear. Adelaide wasn't expected to last long either. After supper, as Adelaide helped clear the dishes, she overheard Mrs. Wilkins talking to Thomas in a low, urgent whisper in the pantry. "People will talk, Mr. Jensen. A single woman. In your house. It ain't proper." "You're here 3 days a week as a chaperone." Thomas's voice was firm, but strained. "She's a respectable lady in a difficult position. I won't have her staying in that boarding house." "It's not my place to say." The old woman's voice dropped even lower, carrying a warning that made the hairs on Adelaide's arms stand up. "But you mind those boys don't get too attached. They've already buried one mother. They don't need the disappointment of losing another." Adelaide clattered a plate, pretending she hadn't heard, but the words echoed in her mind. Disappointment. The housekeeper hadn't said leaving. She had said losing. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, a soft knock came at her door. It was Thomas. He stood in the hallway, a book in his hands. "I thought you might like to see their old school books," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Thank you," she said, taking the heavy volume. He lingered in the doorway. "I want to thank you again. The boys, they took to you. That doesn't happen often." "They're wonderful children," she said honestly. A shadow crossed his face again, the same one from the train platform. "I try, but a ranch is no place to raise boys alone. They need a firm hand, but also a gentle heart." He looked down at his own calloused, powerful hands as if they were foreign objects. "I only seem to know the firm part." His vulnerability was disarming. For a moment she saw past the confident rancher to the lonely, grieving widower underneath. As she closed the door, she leaned against the cool wood, her heart pounding. There were secrets in this house. She could feel them in the walls, in the silences between conversations, in the haunted look that sometimes appeared in Thomas Jensen's stormy eyes. Mrs. Wilkins's words came back to her. "They've already buried one mother." It sounded so simple. "A fever," he had said. But as Adelaide opened the old schoolbook, something fluttered out from between the pages. It wasn't a bookmark. It was a pressed flower, a wild desert rose, its petals faded and brittle with age. And tucked inside was a small folded piece of paper. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. It was a drawing, a child's drawing. A stick figure of a woman with bright yellow hair lying in a bed. But it wasn't the drawing that made Adelaide's blood run cold. It was the single word scrawled underneath in a child's clumsy print. "Sorry." The next morning, Adelaide woke to the sounds of the ranch already in full swing. She dressed and went to the kitchen, determined to act as if nothing was wrong. She found Mrs. Wilkins kneading dough with a vengeance. "Morning," Adelaide said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help?" Mrs. Wilkins grunted and gestured with her chin toward a bowl of eggs. "Make yourself useful." As they worked, the silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, the older woman spoke, her back still to Adelaide. "Been a long time since a lady was in this kitchen." She sighed, a sound like grinding stones. Sarah Jensen. She was a fine woman, city-raised, like you. This life, it wasn't what she was meant for. Mr. Jensen seems devoted to her memory, Adelaide ventured carefully. Mrs. Wilkins snorted, a sharp, dismissive sound. 4 years is a long time to grieve. A man needs a wife, especially out here. She turned then, wiping floury hands on her apron, her eyes boring into Adelaide. But it takes a special kind of woman, one who knows when to ask questions and when to leave things be. The warning was unmistakable. After breakfast, lessons began. The schoolroom was a small, sunlit space, but it felt claustrophobic. Adelaide tried to focus, but the child's drawing was a burning image in her mind. Samuel, the oldest, was sharp and intelligent, but there was a wall around him she couldn't seem to penetrate. Elijah was eager to please, while little Matthew was a bundle of endless energy. It was Samuel who was the puzzle. He answered her questions correctly but mechanically, his eyes watching her with an unnerving stillness. It wasn't defiance, it was assessment. He was judging her. That afternoon, Thomas offered to show her more of the ranch. As they stood on a ridge overlooking his vast property, he spoke of his dreams, of building this place from nothing. Sarah would have loved to see it like this, he said, his gaze distant. She always wanted the boys to have room to run. What about you, Miss Foster? He asked, turning his intense gaze on her. What really made a Boston schoolteacher answer an ad to come west? She gave him the simple version of her story, the closed school, the lack of family. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. She left out the bone-deep loneliness, the quiet desperation that had made her take such a wild gamble. And instead of a home, you found rejection, he said, his voice laced with anger on her behalf. The man was a fool. As they walked back to the house, a comfortable silence fell between them. Adelaide found herself watching him, the easy way he moved, the quiet authority in his voice. He was a good man, she thought, a man of substance, but he was also a man with secrets. Over the next few days, a routine formed. Lessons in the morning, chores and exploring in the afternoon. Adelaide found she enjoyed the rhythm of ranch life. She even began to thaw the frosty Mrs. Wilkins, who seemed to grudgingly accept her presence. But the mystery of Sarah Jensen remained. There were no portraits of her in the house. It was as if she had been erased, except for the lingering sadness in her husband's eyes and the strange, watchful silence of her oldest son. One evening, a storm rolled in, trapping them all indoors. After the younger boys were in bed, Adelaide found Samuel in the main room, staring into the fire. She sat down quietly in the chair opposite him. A penny for your thoughts, Samuel. He didn't look at her. He just kept staring at the flames. Pa says you're here to be our teacher. That's right. Mr. Phillips was our teacher. He left. I heard, she said softly. Samuel finally turned to look at her, his young face serious and old beyond his years. Are you going to leave too? I don't have any plans to, she said. His eyes, so like his father's, narrowed slightly. Are you going to try and be our new mother? The question was a direct hit, sharp and painful. Before she could formulate an answer, he spoke again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Because you can't be. Nobody can. He stood up abruptly. My mother didn't just die of a fever. Adelaide's heart stopped. What do you mean, Samuel? He looked toward the hallway, as if afraid his father would hear. She was sad, he whispered. The baby died, and she got sadder and sadder. And then, she went to sleep in the barn and didn't wake up. He stared at Adelaide, his eyes filled with the terrible ancient grief. Pa said it was the fever, but it wasn't. It was the sadness. He turned and fled the room, leaving Adelaide sitting by the fire, the crackling flames doing nothing to warm the sudden ice in her veins. Thomas had lied to her. It wasn't a fever. It was something far darker. A despair so deep his wife had chosen to leave her children behind. And the drawing. Sorry. It wasn't an apology for making a mess. It was an apology for what his mother had done. Adelaide now understood the weight of the secrets in this house. She wasn't just a teacher filling a temporary role. She had stumbled into the heart of a family tragedy, a wound so deep they couldn't even speak its name. And Thomas Jensen, the strong, capable rancher, was trying to hold it all together with a lie. The revelation changed everything. Every interaction with Thomas was now colored by what she knew. The way he looked at his sons held a new layer of pain and fierce protectiveness. His moments of quiet sadness were no longer a mystery. He was a man drowning in guilt, trying to shield his children from a truth he thought would destroy them. Adelaide found her heart aching for him, and for the boys, especially Samuel. The weight he carried on his small shoulders was immense. She began to focus her efforts on him, not just on his lessons, but on earning his trust. She didn't push him to talk about his mother. Instead, she shared stories of her own life in Boston, of her own loneliness after her parents passed. She showed him her own vulnerabilities, hoping he would see a kindred spirit. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the wall around him began to crumble. He started asking her questions, lingering after lessons were over. One afternoon, he found her in the garden and shyly handed her a carved piece of wood. It was a small, intricately detailed bird. "I made it," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "My mother, she liked birds." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother since his confession. Adelaide's throat tightened. "It's beautiful, Samuel. Thank you." That evening, a circuit rider, a traveling preacher, stopped at the ranch for the night, a common practice in the remote territory. After supper, as they all sat in the main room, the preacher, a kindly old man named Reverend Miller, turned to Thomas. "It's good to see some light back in this house, Thomas. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing Miss Foster to you." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Wilkins, who was darning socks by the fire, shot a warning look from Adelaide to the preacher. Reverend Miller, oblivious, continued. "I remember Sarah's funeral like it was yesterday. Such a tragedy. A woman in her prime, to be taken by such a sudden, violent illness." Adelaide froze. Violent illness. That wasn't sadness. That wasn't a quiet death in the barn. "Reverend," Thomas said, his voice low and tight with warning. "It's in the past." But the preacher was on a roll. To think, a simple infection from a rusty nail. If only Doc Adams had gotten here from Tucson a day sooner. It's a terrible thing, Lockjaw. Lockjaw. The word hung in the air, electric and dangerous. Adelaide stared at Thomas, whose face had gone pale as bone. She glanced at Samuel, whose eyes were wide with confusion. Lockjaw. Not a fever. Not a quiet, sad suicide. A gruesome, painful, unstoppable infection. An accident. The lies were unraveling. But why? Why would Thomas invent one lie and Samuel another? What was the real truth? Adelaide felt like she was trapped in a house of mirrors, where every reflection was a distortion of the one before. The sadness Samuel described was real. She was sure of it. The baby dying, his mother's grief, that had the ring of truth. But was it the whole story? After the preacher had retired for the night, the house was thick with a tense, suffocating silence. Thomas avoided Adelaide's eyes, busying himself with banking the fire for the night. Finally, she could bear it no longer. "Thomas." He straightened up slowly, his face grim in the flickering firelight. He knew what was coming. "The preacher said it was Lockjaw," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Samuel told me. He told me his mother took her own life in the barn because she was so sad about the baby." Thomas closed his eyes, his broad shoulders slumping. The strong rancher seemed to shrink before her eyes. "Both are true, Adelaide, and both are lies." He sank into a chair, running a hand over his face. "There was another baby," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears. "A girl. She was stillborn. Sarah. It broke something inside her. She fell into a darkness I couldn't pull her out of. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, just sat and stared at the wall for hours." He paused, gathering himself. "One afternoon, I came back from rounding up strays and found her in the barn. She had tried to end her life. I got there in time. I stopped her. But in the struggle, she fell against an old piece of farm equipment. A rusty tine gashed her leg, deep." He looked up at Adelaide, his eyes hollow with a grief so profound it stole her breath. "We cleaned it, bandaged it. We thought it would be fine. But a few days later, the fever started, then the spasms. By the time we realized it was lockjaw, it was too late. It was a terrible way to die." The full, horrifying picture finally clicked into place. "I told everyone it was just an accident, that she'd slipped and cut herself. A simple lie to protect her reputation, to protect the boys from whispers and pity," he continued, his voice cracking. "But Samuel, he was only 6, but he was smart. He'd seen her sadness. He knew she'd been in the barn. He put the pieces together in his own way and created a story he could understand, that the sadness killed her. I let him believe it. It seemed kinder than the truth." "The truth being what?" Adelaide whispered. "That I failed her," he said, the words torn from his soul. "I couldn't save her from her grief. And when she tried to leave us, my saving her is what actually killed her. I've lived with that every day for 4 years." The confession left Adelaide speechless. The weight of his guilt was a physical presence in the room. This was the secret he'd been guarding. This was the source of the shadows in his eyes. He wasn't just a widower. He was a man who blamed himself for his wife's agonizing death. She crossed the room and knelt before his chair, taking his large, calloused hands in her own. They were trembling. "That is not your fault, Thomas," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You did what any loving husband would do. You fought for her. You fought for your family." He looked at her, his stormy eyes swimming with tears. In that moment, the last of her own walls came down. She wasn't just a teacher, a guest, a potential bride. She was a woman falling in love with a broken, beautiful man who desperately needed someone to see the truth of his good heart. This ranch wasn't just a temporary refuge anymore. It was starting to feel like home. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she couldn't leave. Not now. The shared secret forged a new, unspoken bond between them. Thomas began to lean on her, not just for help with the boys, but for companionship. The haunted look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a warmth that was directed solely at her. Their evenings were now spent in quiet conversation after the boys were asleep. He told her about Sarah, the vibrant, laughing woman she had been before the darkness took her. And Adelaide, in turn, told him about her quiet, lonely life in Boston, of her dreams of having a family of her own. One afternoon, they rode out to a beautiful spot by a creek, a place Thomas said had been Sarah's favorite. As they sat on a blanket, the late afternoon sun warming their faces, he turned to her. "Adelaide," he said, his voice serious, "when I asked you to stay, I promised not to pressure you, but it's been nearly 2 months, and my feelings, well, they've grown stronger every day." Her heart started to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Mine as well, Thomas." A slow smile spread across his face, lighting up his eyes. "I'm not a man for fancy words, but I know my own heart, and I think it's starting to belong to you." He took her hand. "I want you to know, when you're ready, I'd be honored to make this arrangement permanent." Before she could respond, the sound of a horse approaching made them both look up. A lone rider was coming toward them, a man dressed in a fine city suit that looked ridiculous out here on the open range. As he drew closer, Adelaide felt a jolt of ice water in her veins. She recognized him. It was Mr. Gable, the man from the telegram, the man who had declared her too old. He reined in his horse, a smug, self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Well, well, Miss Foster, I see you've landed on your feet." His eyes swept over Thomas with disdain, taking in his work clothes and the rugged set of his jaw. "Gable," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. He had risen to his feet, placing himself slightly in front of Adelaide. "You're on my land." "So I see," Gable sneered. "I was in Sweetwater on business, heard a rumor you'd taken in my cast off." He looked directly at Adelaide. "I must admit, I may have been a bit hasty. Town life doesn't agree with most women. Perhaps a rustic setting is more your speed. If you've tired of playing nursemaid to this dirt farmer and his brats, my original offer might still be on the table." Rage, hot and pure, surged through Adelaide. This man's arrogance was breathtaking. But before she could speak, Thomas stepped forward. "The only offer you'll be making is an apology to the lady," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And then you'll get off my land before I have you removed." Gable laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You in what army, Jensen?" What happened next was a blur. Thomas moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. One moment he was standing by the blanket, the next he had Gable by the front of his fancy coat, hauling him clean off his horse. "This army," Thomas said, his face inches from Gable's. "You insulted a guest in my home. You insulted the woman I intend to make my wife. You will apologize to her. Now." Gable, his face pale and his arrogance gone, stammered out a weak apology toward Adelaide. Thomas held him for a moment longer, then shoved him backward. Gable scrambled onto his horse and galloped away without a backward glance. Adelaide was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer force of Thomas's protective fury. He turned back to her, his chest still heaving. He looked at her, his eyes blazing. "Did you hear what I said?" "That you were going to have him removed?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "The other part," he said, taking a step closer. "The part about the woman I intend to make my wife." He took her hands in his. "I meant it, Adelaide. I love you. I didn't know I could feel this way again, but I do." Tears welled in her eyes. "I love you too, Thomas." "Then marry me," he said, his voice urgent. "Don't make me wait. Be my wife. Be a mother to my sons. Let us be a family." "Yes," she whispered, the word a release of all the hope and fear she'd been holding inside. "Yes, Thomas, with all my heart." He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was fierce and tender and full of promise. It wasn't a gentle, tentative first kiss. It was a sealing of a pact, a claiming. In the middle of the Arizona wilderness, with the taste of dust and fury and love on their lips, Adelaide Foster finally found her home. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in August, just a month away. There was no reason to wait. News of their engagement spread through Sweetwater like a prairie fire, and for the most part, the small community was delighted. Thomas Jensen was a respected man, and Adelaide, the quiet, dignified schoolteacher, had already earned their admiration. The Jensen boys were ecstatic. Samuel, now that the truth of his mother's death was something he could discuss openly with his father and Adelaide, seemed lighter, the old man's seriousness replaced by a boyish enthusiasm. One evening, a week before the wedding, Thomas found her in the small schoolroom, long after the lessons were over. He came and stood behind her chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. "I have something for you," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He pulled a small, velvet-wrapped object from his pocket. Adelaide unwrapped it. It was a locket, simple and elegant, made of silver. She opened it. On one side was a tiny, expertly rendered portrait of Thomas. The other side was empty. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "Sarah never wanted to put her picture in it. She said it should be saved for the woman who would see the boys into manhood." He gently took the locket and fastened it around her neck. "It belongs to you now." The weight of the silver against her skin was the weight of love, of trust, of a future she had never dared to dream of. The morning of the wedding was bright and clear. Mrs. Wilkins, who had transformed from a suspicious critic to a fierce ally, fussed over Adelaide like a mother hen. "He's a good man, Miss Foster," she said, her voice gruff with emotion as she helped Adelaide with her dress. "You're both lucky." "I know," Adelaide said, her heart full. The ceremony was held in the small church in town, and it seemed the entire population had crammed into the pews. Adelaide walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Thomas. He stood tall and handsome, his 3 sons beside him, scrubbed clean and wearing identical solemn expressions of pride. When he slipped the simple gold band on her finger, his hand was steady, his voice thick with emotion. "With this ring, I thee wed." The celebration back at the ranch was a joyous, raucous affair that lasted long into the night. Adelaide danced with her new husband, with each of her new sons, and with nearly every rancher in the county. As the party was winding down, little Matthew tugged on her dress. He looked up at her, his eyes serious. "Are you really our mother now?" "I am," she confirmed, her heart swelling. "And you'll never leave, like our first mama did?" She knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in hers. She looked from his face to Samuel's and Elijah's, who were standing nearby. "Your first mama didn't want to leave you," she said softly but clearly. "A terrible accident happened, but I am here now, and I will do everything in my power to stay with you for a very, very long time." Later that night, when the last guest had departed and the boys were asleep, Thomas swept her up into his arms and carried her over the threshold of their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jensen," he murmured against her hair. In the years that followed, Jensen's Crossing was filled with a new kind of light. A year after their wedding, Adelaide gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Sarah Elizabeth, honoring both the past and the future. 2 years later, another son, James, completed their family. Adelaide loved all 5 of her children fiercely and equally, and the 3 older boys, who had known such sorrow, blossomed under her care. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would sit with Thomas on the porch, his arm around her, and look out at the vast, starry sky. She would remember the woman who had arrived on that train platform, shattered and alone, with nothing but a trunk and a cruel telegram. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different person entirely. That rejection hadn't been an ending, it had been a redirection. A sharp, painful turn onto a path she never would have chosen for herself. A path that had led her not to what she thought she wanted, but to everything she had ever truly needed. It had led her home. If you enjoyed this story of justice and second chances, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.